This is a video on the Battle of Dara. Firstly, I will show you the animation of the battle, and then I will discuss the details in the preceding events that lead us to that animation. The Persian cavalry move forwards to fire arrows at the Romans. Note the rotations. Now the Persian cavalry charge on the right. The Romans ambush it with flank charges. There are 3,000 Persian casualties. Now the Immortals are sent to the left, and the Romans mirror and flank charge. The Persian wing and army is routed with 5,000 more casualties. Belisarius pursues for a bit, but soon calls it off. The Battle of Dara was fought between the Romans and the Persians, or the Byzantines and the Sassanians if you want to call them that, in the year 530 AD. The general of the Romans was Belisarius, and the general of the Persians was Perozes. The Battle of Dara is unique in several ways. The first of which is tactically, for the manner in which the trenches guided how the combat unfolded, and also because the Romans managed to win whilst outnumbered 2-1, a very impressive feat. The second reason of which is to do with our sources, as Procopius was an eyewitness to the event. The third and final reason is that using the sources and modern satellite imagery, the potential site of the battlefield can be narrowed down to a few square kilometres. The following is a map by user C. Placidus from Wikimedia Commons. As you can see, if you look just below the centre of the map, are the cities of Dara and Nisibis, with the Romans to the west and the Sassanids to the east. The reason why Dara was fortified and existed in the location it was to be opposite the city of Nisibis, which had been ceded in a treaty several hundred years earlier. So currently, as we said before, the date is 530, and the Romans and the Sassanids generally waged war either by attacking through the land by Dara and Nisibis, which is sort of the gap between the mountains and the desert, or by raiding into Armenia and the Caucasus. To all intents and purposes, Dara controls access to Syria and Anatolia for the Romans. It's crucial. I am displaying the unannotated 3D height map so you can have a bit more of a look at the geography. I would like you to note especially the valley to the south of Dara, which is the only way a large force could reach the city when advancing from the city of Amodis. On the first day, the Persian general Perozes marched from Nisibis to Dara with 40,000 men and was met by Belisarius' 25,000 men. There was an unsuccessful Persian skirmish on the right flank. A young Persian rode back and forth across his lines, challenging the Romans to single combat. An attendant known as Andreas came forwards and smote the first Persian. He returned to his lines a hero. A second Persian came forth, and Andreas, unbidden and unrequested, came forth again and won a second single combat. As the Romans had wanted to fight a field battle and not a siege, Perozes had sent word to Nisibis, and 10,000 reinforcements marched to him on the second day. Perozes did not fight with these reinforcements on the second day, as marching 20 kilometres in a day and then fighting, it would be silly. Instead, letters were exchanged between the two commanders to see if hostilities could be avoided. They could not be. Familiarise yourself with the geography of the valley in which I think the battle is fought. Whilst you're doing this, I'm going to be talking about why Belisarius was fighting a field battle. Now, it's worth remembering that Belisarius hadn't been tasked with defending Dara. The Emperor Justinian had sent him on an expedition to raid Persia. The Persians just happened to have a larger force. However, Belisarius was sent with 25,000 men. 25,000 men can't fit in the city of Dara. It's not big enough to billet them. Let me give an example. In the 537 siege of Rome, Belisarius held the city with only 5,000 men. 5,000 men, Rome, the former capital. 25,000 men, the city of Dara, on the Syrian desert. So Belisarius' men didn't fit within the city, and as the source John Malalas tells us, Belisarius was encamped outside the city. He was encamped, presumably, to the south of the city where the ground is good and there's a good water supply. That is why he fought, because his camp was outside the city and he had to defend himself. Now, I believe that the battle was fought in the Ambar Gap following Christopher Lillington Martin's paper on the subject. I had an interview with Chris not too long ago, and you can watch the half-hour interview on my channel. But it would be logical for the battle to be fought there. If we think Belisarius is fighting somewhere in that valley, and I think we should, as two sources tell us that the Persians advanced from Amodis north to Dara, then fighting at a narrower point, with your flanks being covered, would make perfect sense. And John Malalas, if I'm not mistaken, even says the Romans almost advanced towards the Persians. They moved away from their camp in the city to reach it. And this site is about 2.5 kilometres to the south of the city of Dara. It seems very reasonable. It gives enough space for manoeuvring and also a retreat. Faris asked Belisarius if he could take his Herulians out into the low hills on the Roman left. Belisarius agreed, possibly because he expected the first Persian blow to land there, after their skirmish on the first day had signalled their potential moves later on. Now I shall briefly list the Roman and Persian commanders. We'll start with the Romans, and as we've just moved him out into the low hills, there is Faris with 300 Herulians. On the Roman left, we have Bootzes commanding the cavalry. Moving in and at the front, we have Sunikas. There's Sunikas and Aigen, but Sunikas is the important one. Behind Sunikas, there is a block of infantry who are controlled by someone we don't know. At the back and in the middle is Belisarius himself, the commander-in-chief of all of the eastern forces. At the front right, there are some more Huns, and then to the right of them, there are 5 different commanders, of whom it's interesting that one of them might be Justinian's cousin. Now to the Persians. The Persians are led by Perozes, as we've talked about before, and he was stationed in the centre. On the Persian right, the cavalry was led by Pityaxes. On the Persian left, the Persians were led by Baras Manas, who is described as one-eyed. As a flank commander, one wonders if his eye was the left eye, and that could explain why he didn't see any moves on the right when they were being made during the battle. In the back and in the centre are the Immortals, who are heavy cavalry, and at the very back are some Persian infantry. It's worth setting the scene a touch more. The date is June or July 530 AD. The sun is hot, and when the Persians attack at midday, it's high in the sky, pointing ever so slightly into the Romans' faces, but it's not mentioned in the sources. The wind is blowing from behind the Romans, and the Roman position is ever so slightly uphill of the Persians, because it's going up a valley. This is important for later, when the Immortals will move to the left and Belisarius will see it and mirror appropriately. It's also the age of cavalry warfare. The Roman infantry, which is generally accepted to be better than the Persian infantry, is not only behind a trench, but behind a recessed portion of the trench in the very centre. The Persian infantry stays at the back of the battle and barely participates except when they're routed and cut down. The Persian infantry very well could have just been there for the siege works. Nevertheless, the Persian cavalry, if we assume it makes up 60% of the forces, there's still 30,000 of them. They still have a large numerical advantage against the 25,000 Romans, who are possibly also 60% cavalry. Finally, we can talk about the trench. Procopius describes the central portion as being offset but parallel to the wings. Procopius does not describe how large the offset is, or even if the offset is in front or behind. The generally assumed idea is that the central portion is behind the wings, as the battle unfolds starting on the wings, because if they were in front they would be attacked first. Furthermore, if the recessed portion of the trench defends the infantry, as would be planned because the infantry is poorer as we discussed, the central portion would be recessed. Furthermore, The infantry have a slightly longer range than the cavalry when it comes to shooting arrows, and so a recessed trench could allow the infantry and the Huns to shoot at the same time, whilst the Persian cavalry opposite is being hit by both. Ian Hughes, in his book Belisarius, the Last Roman General, puts forward the other viewpoint, that the central portion is in front of the wings. I don't agree with it, but the depth of the offset is interesting. If the battlefield is about 2.5 kilometres wide, then most diagrams which show the battle show the central trench being offset by 500 odd metres, which seems to be ridiculous. Why would someone make the central trench offset by such a long distance? And the yardstick we need to remember is that the effective range of a bow shot might be 150 metres, 100. You would want the centre to be able to reinforce the wings. And so I've drawn a very tight trench in comparison to most of them. If anything, it's still too big. This is a 1 to 18 depth to width, and I'm actually going for more like 1 to 25 in reality. But you've got to be able to actually see it, so there's a little bit of depth there. It's worth talking about the positioning. The trench is described as being a stone's throw from the gate/gap. I'm going on the interpretation that it is definitely a gap rather than a gate, which locks the right-hand side of the trench from the Romans' point of view onto the Ambar Hill. No one knows where the left-hand side of the trench goes. It's not known. And there are passages going across the trench. No one knows how many passages there were or how wide they were until we do some archaeology. And it's very exciting. There have been some arrows found there which would suggest a battle. There are ideas for an archaeological dig on the 1500th anniversary of the battle, so that's Dara 2030, and hopefully that area of the world would be a little bit safer to do a large project like that in. The Persians began their attack at midday. Their cavalry moved forwards and began firing arrows at the Romans. There was a wind blowing from behind the Roman lines, so despite the Persians outnumbering the Romans and being able to use those numbers to constantly rotate in fresh troops, neither side really had the better of the arrow fire. The Persian cavalry charges on the right. They push back Bootsies and his forces, but Pharis, who was hiding in the hills, came out and ambushed them by attacking them in their rear. Sunnikas and Aigen, being able to easily manoeuvre their lightly armoured 600 Huns, cross over the passages in the trench and hit them in the flank. The Persians are caught on 3 sides and suffer 3,000 casualties in retreat. Pharis joins the rest of the army. Perozes sent the Immortals to the left, which he'd been holding in reserve. Belisarius, being up the valley from this, can see this happening despite it being done quote-unquote stealthily, and moves his own forces to counter this attack. His own guard cavalry are stationed behind the infantry, out of sight. Sunnikas is told to join Simus and Ascan in that front portion of the trench. The Persian left, being controlled by Barismanus, charges. They break through the Roman right, but are counter-charged. Procopius describes the Persian right being broken into 2 pieces, a larger portion at the front and a smaller portion at the back. The smaller portion at the back contains Barismanus himself and the standard-bearer. Procopius records that Sunnikas, leader of the Huns, charged and killed Barismanus' standard-bearer. Subsequently, Sunnikas then killed Barismanus himself, at which point the Persians, trapped at the front of the charge, panicked and began to be cut down by the Romans who surrounded them. The Persians who could managed to escape, but Procopius reports that 5,000 of the Persians were killed. The entire Persian army routed, and the Roman cavalry pursued. The Roman cavalry cut down some of the infantry, but Belisarius, keeping a tight rein on his horsemen, drew them back for fear of the Persians reorganising and sundering what was a good victory. And once more in full. Guys, thank you very much for watching. It's been about a year in the making from beginning of planning to where we've got to. I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe and share. Cheers! Such, then, was the fortune of armies in Mesopotamia.